Right, let's talk about what pass by value really means now. It simply means we're just going to pass a copy of what's stored in one variable to another function. Right? So we go back and distinguish, in order to distinguish parameters from arguments, right? We call this a parameter list. So whenever we define a function, we often use the vocabulary and say this is a parameter list. And when we pass information to a function, so here when we call the function and pass information to it, we often call those arguments. That's the distinction that they make between the two. Try to be consistent with my vocabulary, but a lot of times people just call both arguments, right? So you have to know in what context they're talking about it, right? Pass by value, right? Anytime we have an argument in a list, which is normally going to be a variable name, might be an expression, that's passed by value. In other words, a copy of its value is passed to that parameter, except for arrays. So we'll take a look at arrays, right? So we'll evaluate each argument, whatever value it has, we'll pass a copy of that value to the function parameters memory, right? And we'll see that when we change things in there, passing by value doesn't have any effect on another function. So I think it's easier to just actually go ahead and see an example of that as opposed to discussing it. Right. Let me minimize that. Let's go back then. So here, let's go back to our calc sum example. Right. In the previous lecture, we had created this function calc sum. It calculates the sum of two integers. Right. We've declared its existence up here with its prototype. Here in main, we went ahead and let the user enter values for x and y. We passed copies of what was stored in x and y. We talked about order. Let's just go back to x and y here. So in calc sum, I just want to show you that in here, num1 and num2 are going to get copies of the values. And if we actually change, say for some reason we say, let's say that num1, it's assigned to num1, num1, let's just double its value, times 2, right? And let's do the same thing to num2. We'll just add 5. Let's add 5 to num2. I'm just randomly picking things. Right. So let's just go ahead and do a run to cursor so we can rebuild. All right. So remember, program execution always starts in main. It's sitting here waiting for us to enter a value for x because we started here in main. We printed out this message, and now scanf is waiting for me to add something or enter something. So I'll enter 10 for x, hit the enter key. Let's do 12 for y. Right. Now we can see here in main, it's local variables, right? X and y. X has 10, y has 12. Right. Some doesn't have anything in it, has garbage. That's something I will do a step into. So step into then shows us that we step into, we call this function. So our program goes from here to execute this code. So num1 got the value of 10. It got the value of 10 simply because x is the first thing in the list. X back here in main has a value of 10. So a copy of the value 10 is passed to num1 and assigned to num1. Right. Same way the value stored in y back here in main was 12. And so that value, a copy of that value got passed here to num2. That's how it got its value when we called this function. Right. Now if we execute these next two statements, right, we doubled num1 and we added 5 to num2, we can see the values here change. The values num1 and num2 change. Right. Because I got copies of what's in x and y, when we go back to main, we're going to see that the variables in main retain their value. Right, so we'll just do next line. We add this. We're going to return the sum of 37. Right, next line. Now we're back in main. Back in main, x and y retain their values. So we say just a copy of the value that was stored in x and a copy of the value that was stored in y was passed to this function. So passed by value means no matter what changes we make to those values that were passed from here, it has no effect on the variables, on what's stored in the variables in another function. Right? No effect at all. That's what pass by value means. Right? We can do anything we want here. It doesn't affect what's stored in memory back here when we do a pass by value. Later, when we get to pointers, we'll see that we can change things in memory. But when this isn't a pointer, right, it's just a pass by value. We just passed a copy of what's there. Right? except for arrays. Right? So that's what, right, this pass by value example walks you through here, how to go through different functions, right? So it tells you when, in this example, it's printing out what the value of x and y is before the function was called. It's calling the function here. So when we call the function, this function here, these variables a and b, get a copy of what's stored in x and y, the 5 and the -1, right? This function makes changes to what's in a and b, right, at the end of this function. So it shows you what a and b is at the beginning, what it is at the end, right? But then when we leave this function, return back to main. So here's where the function was called a main. So we return back here, right? Afterwards, you're going to see that main's x and y still have the same values, right? Even if we name them the same thing. Let's go back here. Let's go back in our example here. Maybe you think because these names are different, that's why. What happens if I call this x and this y? So I need to now make this x. Right. This y. That was x. This is y. All right. Now let's stop the debugger. Right, I'm going to rebuild by doing a run to cursor. Okay, once again, our code starts executing here in main. It's waiting for us to give something for x. So how about 6 for x, 7 for y? So here in main, right, x and y, the x and y that belong to main have 6 and 7. Now we're going to call this function and pass a value, pass a copy of the value stored in memory. So step into, right, shows us now here, this x and y, notice these are function arguments, they're not locals, right? They're arguments because they're here in the parameter list. This x and y have their own values. Let's go ahead, next line, next line. Notice we're changing what's in memory. They both happen to have a value of 12 now. We're going to return a value of 24. Right, we're going back to main. Right, we go back to get ready to execute the next statement after the function call. Notice, of course, here in main, we updated the value of sum because we returned that value from this function. But notice back here, x and y retain their original values. So this x and y defined in this function has its own separate memory space that's different from this x and y, right? And we did not affect what main's x and y by making changes to calc sum's x and y, right? That comes in handy being able to use the same variable names. At this point in programming, it may seem to be, it's a little bit confusing. It's probably easier to name everything something different, right? So you're not getting confused about what belongs to what function. But as programs get longer and longer, we often want to reuse variable names. That makes it very convenient. Right, remember, this x and y is local to main, this x and y is local to calc sum. And that was our whole idea of pass by value. Right, the next lecture then will cover what happens when we pass arrays.